Hello, everyone, and welcome to this next episode of the Sustainable Connections podcast. I'm Mark Lee. I'm delighted to be back with you. If you are a regular listener, you'll know that I'm the Global Director of Thought Leadership at ERM. Today, I'm really so pleased to have somebody who's been familiar to me for decades now, John Elkington, who is, at least presently, the founder and chief pollinator at Volans Ventures, which we'll have him explain as we move forward, but was also the founder of Sustainability, where John and I worked together and overlapped in board leadership as he moved to that level, and I took on the CEO role kind of decade and a half ago. And of course, Sustainability was ultimately acquired by ERM. So we share a partial history in this field and go back working with some clients together as late as the late 1990s, I think, John. We were knocking around in Dearborn talking with Bill Ford's leadership team about Ford Motor Company's early efforts. So this has been going on for a while. It's great to have you here. Maybe I'll just let you say hello before I carry on with a bit of intro and framing this conversation.
Well, it's been going on since the last century, and doesn't that make us seem old? Mark, it's wonderful to hear your voice, and it's a delight to be part of the conversation. And I hope it's two-way. I don't simply want to do a Q&A, so I'll throw some things back at you if I may.
I'm guessing, John, lots of our listeners are going to know who you are and possibly have read some of your works. I think, the context for me is that you've just been positioned as one of the leading thinkers on sustainability for much of your career. You've published 21 books, and one of the reasons we're talking today is that your 21st just came out very recently. And that'll be one of the subjects to nurse around. The new book is called Tickling Sharks: How We Sold Business on Sustainability. And absolutely, we'll get into that and some of the writing you've been doing following it, but also want to take opportunity to range a bit across the state of the field and hear where you think it's going. And let's start with the new book. If you can just explain why, at this time, Tickling Sharks: How We Sold Business on Sustainability, and kind of what's at the heart of it. And if I can probe a bit, did we sell business on sustainability? It seems very much a work in progress, and we're living in a moment of backlash and companies walking back some of the commitments they've made. So how does the title stand up even these just a few months after publication?
Well, I think we did sell business on using the word sustainability. Whether they properly understood what they should have been meaning when they spoke about that concept, I'm not so sure. And I think some of these political challenges that we now face are in some ways inevitable. I mean, I've been, as you know, looking at the trends and particularly the cycles and waves in this space since 1994. And there are these inevitable points where there are corrections. It happens in the economy. More generally, you go sort of boom to a recession or even a bust. And I think we are in a recessionary moment, both with the ESG and I think probably increasingly with sustainability. But to your question, why the book? Well, partly I was just almost born writing books, it seems. But this one in particular had been creeping up on me for quite a while. And one of the reasons for that was I've spent my life working in other parts of the world, and very often, to start with, very powerful people in business would ask the question, why are you doing what you're doing? I mean, are you a communist? There was this assumption that you had to be either clinically insane or politically deadly to the capitalist system if you were promoting environment or later concepts like sustainability. But then over time, that shifted. The idea of the book was, let's look back at 75 years now of life. Let's look back at 50 years this year of professional engagement in environment and sustainability. But along the way, let's just explain to people what it was like at the various different stages in all of this, and do it in a relatively candid way. And just finally, you mentioned, you and I working with Bill Ford at the Ford Motor Company. One of the stories I tell in the book was when they did the tire recall exercise. That I was asked by, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, while we were working with the company, is this Ford's Tylenol moment where they've gone way beyond what anyone could have sensibly expected of a company like this. So hundreds of people had been killed when these Firestone tires primarily burst in hot conditions, Saudi Arabia, southwestern states, United States, and so on, as you will remember. And my
Mhm.
answer for publication was no, they haven't. I think 6 million tires, which I think was the first recall, is a good start. But Ford is still making the point that these are Firestone tires, not Ford tires. And I don't think many people, when they buy a particular automobile or car, think that it's made up of lots of different brands and offerings. It is a Ford car, and you have to take responsibility for that. And I tell the story of then turning up in the boardroom in Dearborn of Ford and having Jack Nasser, who you will remember, as
Mhm.
CEO, running around the table, basically asking what people thought. This was the day after the article came out, and he started with me and said, "I do not need to talk to you to understand what your view is all of this." And I think, in a way, the book is an attempt to try and explain why what we have done collectively wasn't pure consultancy. It
Mhm.
had at times a slight political edge and was all. And I always said, I don't want to be neutral. I want to be objective, but I want to be neutral, say 15 years into the future.
Yeah, yeah. I remember one of our former colleagues as well playing with a tagline for sustainability. I'm thinking of Peter Zollinger,
Mm,
and it was objective but not neutral, right? I think was
yes.
his phrasing, which I liked quite a bit, that we want to bring you an objective and thoughtful and reasoned view, but we also are going to have our own perspective on that and why. John, you said at the start of your reply to my opening question there that at least we taught business to use the word sustainability, even if it hasn't been kind of fully implemented. And then
Mm,
I'm connecting that to the Ford story, which, was Ford Firestone, Firestone tires on Ford vehicles, which sort of asked the question about where the edge of responsibility is. So if business beyond Ford has the language down, how far are we in terms of the progress of and the practice, the performance elements? And for the tenor of my first question, did we make the sale? I do believe, at least in part, we did, in that I see a business world that is much, much more aware, informed, and better at aspects of sustainability than decades or even a few years ago.
yeah.
So where have we made some of the more striking progress in your mind?
Well, part of the story I tell is what it was like to approach business, what was then called industry very often,
Mm,
from the outside and try and get an audience or try to engage people. And basically, it was very, very difficult indeed. Whereas these days, we take it for granted that we have access to boardrooms and C-suites and investment houses and so on. That wasn't true 40 or 50 years ago. So you could say that that is an achievement. But I think one of the driving forces there has been a generational shift in the senior leadership of business, in the sense that a human generation is what, 32, 33 years. My sense is that in business, a leadership generation is probably about 7, 8 years, and it's probably shrinking now. So we've probably gone through, 7 or 8 generations since I started. And so the people who've come up, although their business school MBAs and so on didn't necessarily give them all that they will need moving into the future on issues like sustainability, they are much more aware of these sorts of issues. They are absolutely seized with the idea that somebody at some point is going to have to do something on all of this. They'd really rather it was somebody else and later. And I think what is being impressed on them increasingly is that this has an enormous urgency. And just one of the things that's really struck me again, and I remember it in the 90s, 1990s, particularly in the States, I would talk to CEOs in particular, and they would say, "I'm getting beaten up around the breakfast table by my children, saying, you're
mhm,
destroying the environment." And I've heard that message over the last sort of 2.5, 3 years, particularly in Europe, with senior business leaders saying, this has become a family issue. I'm almost being asked, when did you decide to become an eco criminal? And so I think that's one of the drivers. Another is that the regulation has shifted. I think there are dangers there that it drives people towards a compliance mindset, and it puts a lot of this in the laps of lawyers. And I don't love lawyers at the best of times. They're not wildly innovative, and we need incredible innovation at this particular point of time. And just a final point, just to give a sense of where I think things have gone. When you and I first met, we were working on things like sustainability reporting when it wasn't
Hmm.
really a thing, when companies really didn't want to do it. I remember Shell telling me, a very senior person, Shell will never report. We're too big and too complicated. And then sustainability helped them do their first ever sustainability report. If you look at the KPMG surveys now, I'm sure ERM are doing similar things, but what you find is something between 96, 97, 98% of major companies around the world now produce a sustainability report. Well, thank you very much for that. We now have in the EU the sort of corporate sustainability reporting directive, which means a lot of other people will be pushed in that direction too. And the question in my mind is whether we've let supply of sustainability linked information run ahead of demand. I mean, who is using this stuff? I think AI may have a role to play in that, but I
Hmm.
think unless until we start to use that data, that information, and turn it into market intelligence, and then drive system change with that intelligence, I think a lot of this is a bit like akin to genuflection in church. It's something we do because we have to.
I wonder a bit if we're hitting the limits of what sustainability functions, including the CSO, can do alone. They've kind of been appointed, they've gone quite far in the organizational structure. But now, if they aren't deeply connected to finance and technology and the chief economist or chief risk officer, is it possible to get anything more than one plus one is two? And get a multiplier effect in the company. And we're starting a new research project with Salesforce, GlobeScan, again, sustainable IT and accounting for sustainability to explore that, the connection, what each of finance, technology, and sustainability can't do alone, but can only do together.
That's fascinating.
The piece I want to come back to now, John, if I can, is the recession comment.
Yeah.
And we touched really briefly on waves. And maybe you could go back to 1994, explain how you've talked about sustainability progress in both up waves and down waves.
Well, the idea was basically fairly simple. I mean, my favorite subject always at school was history. I did economics as well. I wasn't very good at it, but in economics, I really liked economic history. And one of the things that you learn if you study economies and how they evolve over time, they do have their ups and downs. And you have these people like Nikolai Kondratiev and Joseph Schumpeter and so on who talk about long wave cycles. And I always found that riveting. And I wondered, well, does this apply also to societal pressure waves? And I'd got involved in the late 60s, early 70s in environmentalism. And it was very clear that that had a peak in 1970 around the first Earth Day. And then it waned after a period. And then it would come back and then it would go away again. So I sat down with Nick Robbins, who you'll remember now, a professor at LSE, just across the road from our offices in London. And
Mhm.
we just thought, what's the pattern here? And what we managed to do, I think reasonably sensibly, was to identify a series of wave structures and down waves. And Doug Miller, who was then at GlobeScan, looked at our patterns and said, we see this in our surveys around the world. It doesn't completely sort of verify our thinking, but I know I've tested it in something like 50 countries around the world, and only twice had people push back. The point I've come to recognize over time is that the peak period, so when everyone gets massively excited, everything mainstreams, as ESG has done in recent times. And then you have the correction moment. You overshoot. You have one of these Minsky moments where just people lose connection with reality. And that's why I think these down waves or sort of ESG or sustainability recessionary periods are absolutely vital to the health, longer term health. But I mean, that was the story. And my sense is two things. One is that the intervals between the peak periods is getting shorter
Mhm.
because the reality is just pushing in harder and harder on companies. But secondly, one of the books that had the huge influence on me when I was a child, well, 14 years old, was The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by
Mm.
Thomas Kuhn. He talked about paradigm shifts. Basically, he talked about paradigm shifts taking about 70 to 80 years to crank through. Well, we're about 65 to 70 years into the one that we're talking about here. It started in the late 50s, early 60s. And that's why I think the next 10 to 15 years are going to be absolutely extraordinary. In fact, in the book, I talk about my reasoning that after 50 years of involvement, I think more change is going to happen for good and bad in the next 10 to 15 years in that half century that I've been involved.
And John, you said in there, and I want people to be sure to have heard it,
Hmm.
that for the peaks and troughs of economics as a metaphor and sustainability that we're working on, you said the downturns and the corrections are vital. And I don't know if people would have expected you to end the sentence with vital. So what happens in the down waves that is essential? Why do we need them as much as the racing forward in the peaks? When it appears we make more progress.
Well, partly it's a shakeout. There's a period where, a lot of people go bankrupt or go to the wall. They can't make business sense of what they've been doing. But more importantly, but there is a reflection period, and then there is almost a reinvention period, and people come back, the ones who survive, a bit more coherent, a bit more strategic, and with more oomph. There's more momentum behind what they're doing. So I think this is true in economies as well. I mean, we don't welcome recessions, but they
Mm.
do clean out a lot of dead wood. So I think this one is going to be relatively short. A lot will depend on what happens in November in the US presidential elections. But I almost think, regardless of what happens there, this will, over a 4 to 5 year period, come back very, very strongly indeed. And quite surprisingly, for a lot of people, it will have momentum which they simply did not expect, because we've been holding back something, if that's what we do, which just has this extraordinarily kinetic energy and is yearning to go exponential in terms of solutions to try and match the exponential pace of the problems and challenges. So that's where my brain is. Whether it's accurate in its thinking or not remains to be seen.
Yeah, no, and I think the language is interesting to play with, and my own sort of thinking on what happens in between the waves is, I've often labeled them plateaus instead of down
Yeah,
waves,
yeah,
and thought about the kind of mountain climbing analogy where you climb to a camp and you reacclimatize, and you need to almost regroup and gather strength there before you can go on. And so I've perceived the plateaus as necessary times for embedding what
yeah.
you've learned in the surge or in the previous part of the climb. And I do perceive also, I think you touched this, that those gaps are getting smaller, that the need to catch your breath, gather strength, move on, and apply what you've learned, it's almost immediate. And that goes partly that regardless the geopolitical circumstance, living in a moment of ESG backlash, that does nothing to slow the climatic impacts that are building up, to
Yeah.
slow the rate of biodiversity loss. To those things are just still waiting for you when you get through either the down wave or off the plateau and start moving forward again. And in fact, they've had time to grow. So we somehow have to keep pace in all that.
Well, just very quickly, Mark. I mean, I was at Rothschild and Company yesterday, and I was asked during the discussion period whether I thought we would solve this. And I said, there's no guarantee that we will. Every previous civilization has gone down. That's what civilizations do. I think this is solvable. I think we can do it, but we're leaving ourselves a precariously short window of opportunity in which to do that. And people ask me, and I should ask you the same question, whether I'm optimistic about this. I say, well, it's qualified optimism in the sense that my studying of history, such as it was in terms of study, persuaded me that our species tends to do its best work, its most radically innovative work, when it's backed itself into a corner. And that's exactly what we've done on, exactly as you say, climate change and biodiversity. But given what you see, are you optimistic? Do you think we will change this? If so, it won't happen equally around the world. It'll be in some places, not others. How are you thinking about it, Mark?
Yeah, qualified optimism is a really good way to express it, John. I'm more optimistic than 5 years ago, which I think
I
if
am
you had
too.
asked me 5 years ago, I would not have predicted that. Yeah,
Mm,
so my worry was accelerating. And for our ranging conversation here about where sustainability is at in business and more broadly across the economy, but my day-to-day focus is how this plays out in the private sector.
mm,
There are so many not just committed and motivated people, but incredibly informed and expert people in business. And that's part of how our careers have changed, right? That business used to need organizations like sustainability or Volans or ERM to advise them on what this was and how to begin to approach it. And they still need that on aspects and issues in the agenda, but mostly they need people to help them do it. So we have not by far delivered yet, but I find it incredibly heartening to be in a different era of, operationalizing, embedding, whichever of those words might work, and seeing really ambitious visions for, how do we make the agriculture system regenerative? How will we decarbonize the entire economy on the timeline necessary? And you've probably seen some of the work that people like Nigel Topping and Global Optimism have done on how our progress on new technologies, specifically low carbon in Nigel's case, we tend to project in a linear fashion and it
yeah,
never goes that way. It kind of runs out on a line until it turns into the hockey stick. And for all we worry about our climate progress, the rate of adoption of EVs, the distribution of solar, the distribution of other low carbon forms of energy, our progress on battery storage, all of it is exceeding projections by so much, it's almost laughable. And yet, when we make our next set of projections, we tend to go back into a linear thinking model.
yeah,
Like there's never this, oh, maybe what we need to do is learn how to accelerate the curve instead of project out on a nearly flat line again. And more people, I think, are getting that. More and more people, I think, are doing that. And that leads to some of the investment and maybe the innovation you were seeking in one of your comments earlier. And one of the conversations that's been going on around us has been Unilever's new
yeah.
sustainability plan, the latest iteration of. So, a kind of darling of the sustainability community for a long time, has done some exceptional things, has not always had the most vibrant business performance, has been, in fact, under enormous shareholder pressure at times. So it's been middling sometimes in delivery in terms of operationalizing. But this year, as many folks will know, they changed and they shrank their number of sustainability goals. So this kind of cuts across materiality. How do you focus on the right issues? But many have come back at them and said, this is terrible. Unilever has reduced its ambition. This is a stepping back, nightmare. I wonder what you think. I'm very happy to share what I think. Is this part of what happens even in the down wave? It's the recalibrating and rethinking, or is it a misstep?
It's certainly not a nightmare. It's exactly what you would expect companies to do, just to declare an interest. I've worked with Unilever since 1986. So I've
Mm-hmm.
seen the company go through a fair few cycles. And St. Paul Pullman was one of the people who put an endorsement in the Tickling Sharks. I'm wedded to the idea that Unilever is an innovative company broadly with the right intentions. I've always worried about the way that they tend to dominate the GlobeScan survey results, for example, alongside Patagonia. I think Patagonia, because of its ownership, has been able to do something really quite remarkably different in terms of giving ownership to some considerable degree by proxy to Earth. I mean, who would have thought?
Mm-hmm.
Unilever, I think, is doing what a lot of companies are starting to do. I mean, we saw Ford doing it on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've seen Volvo and Mercedes-Benz doing it on electric vehicles. We've seen Shell do it. I mean, companies have made these bold declarations without really thinking very much about how do we make this reality, and particularly how do we get rewarded by the market for doing some of these things we're promising to do. And I think they're waking up now to the fact that the markets, as they're currently configured, are not going to reward them in quite the way that they perhaps expected. And certainly when you then have people like Robbie Starbuck on some of these sort of influencers out there. But again, I think that's important. And Jonathan Part is one of the people, having chaired the internal advisory board of Unilever for so long, who's really gone public saying this is disgraceful. And my response to that was, well, it's certainly unfortunate. But when there was a stakeholder meeting, I didn't go, but our CEO, Louise, went. And she said, a lot of people were saying to Unilever, it's a tragedy that you're doing this because it's going to dissuade other companies, other clients of ours, from doing the right thing. And I don't think that's a terribly sensible way of coming at this. I think this is the nature of the organisms, the corporate organisms we're trying to influence. It's, that they are very sensitive. They have to be to market signals. If the markets don't signal positivity, well, this happens. So now we've got to say, okay, so now what do we do to shift the markets?
And we need folks to restate what and why they will focus on and how it genuinely connects to what their business can do. John, you mentioned Paul Pullman gave you one of the endorsements for Tickling Sharks, and maybe I'll take that as a cue to go back to the book where we kind of started off. You have been writing a series on in a Substack on how to go about tickling sharks, which of course sounds very dangerous. The titles of each of the 10 tips gives you hints as to where they go. One is about, some self-reflection. If you're going to speak truth to power, then you maybe need to have a word with yourself first about intent and where you really stand. But you also get into the strategic, how do you effectively communicate the very complex ideas underlying sustainability transformation? I'm thinking about ERM and the Sustainable Connections podcast and the audience here. I think we might describe them as focused on applied sustainability, that operationalizing, getting it through the system, making it work at every level of organizations. And I wondered if you could pick one of the 10 tips or a couple that you think might apply to them and tell them how to go about tickling sharks, which might be in their own organizations, getting their own senior leaders to do more, or as influencers.
Well, it may seem impolite to describe people, quite a few of them who've been clients over time. Jack Nasser from Ford, I would say, was a prototypical shark in some ways. And by this, I don't mean he wasn't an intelligent man. I don't mean that he didn't have the best intentions of the company at heart, but tended to snap and bite at things that he didn't understand. These animals, these creatures, this type of leader, if there's a feeding frenzy around, ESG is dead or whatever it happens to be, woomph, they're all in there, and you're stuck with that rather unreflective set of outcomes. One of the things I think I've always done was I've approached people and asked whether I can speak to them. So I mean, in the 70s, 80s, I visited something over 100 companies around the world, or businesses at least. When I did a biotechnology newsletter, again, I did 80 to 100 companies. And every 5 or 6 years, I do sort of a learning journey, a study tour where I go out and talk to people off my own bat. And so what I would say to people, and this is particularly true after COVID and the lockdowns, that we slightly, some of us got out of the habit of going out and seeing, almost pockets of the future, as Bill Sharp calls them, going to visit people who are doing extraordinary things that should be impossible, that in many people's minds are still impossible. As somebody said once, if something exists, it's unlikely to be impossible. So go and see the people, engage them, see what you can learn from them, see how you can support them, see if you can bring them back into your organization to share what they're learning along the way to some of your colleagues. And I think the learning that can happen in that sort of situation, experiential learning, is a lot more, it's visceral, but it's long lasting. And it does shape not just behaviors, but mindsets over time. So that's one of the ones that I hold to quite strongly. But the one thing I would say is be very careful. These people are dangerous. I mean, not quite like great whites, but they have it within their gift, within their power to damage people's reputations. say, don't be missionary in what you do. Don't tell people what you think that they should do without actually having a very clear understanding of who they are, what they're trying to do, and where your recommendations fit into all of that. After Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005, Walmart challenged their supply chain. Two companies pulled me in very short order. I tell the stories in the book. One was DuPont, one was 3M. A board member came up to me and said, "Why do you use humor in what you do at this sort of level?" And I thought, I know I'm dead in the water. She's going to go for me, but not at all. Her training was as a psychologist, and she
Mm,
said she watched me as I did what I did, and she said it was effective for two reasons. The first was that I was playful with my own agenda. I wasn't a missionary. That relaxed the people in the room. But then
mhm,
secondly, I was playful with them. And this isn't telling jokes. It's situational, as you'll have seen. You play off something people are saying in the moment that they say it. And she said, people do not typically do that. They take these people very seriously indeed. And she said the reptilian part of their brain is probably responding by saying, if he can do that, if he's got the nerve to do that, his army outside the walls must be huge. And I never really thought about it that way. But a light touch, I think,
mhm.
is enormously important in all this. You've got to have fun. You've got to enjoy some of the stuff. You've got to find it exciting. And if you do, that translates. People pick that up and they want to be involved too.
That's actually it's such a wonderful place to maybe wrap up, John.
Mhm.
That what I hear in there is on Tickling Sharks, carefully. That's an important part of the message, but also with a degree of conviction and by letting yourself come through in the process, but not to the exclusion of the other person, that hearing what their need is instead of what you want to proselytize or be missionary about. Their side of it is kind of more important. You got to figure out how to influence where they are, or rather than push them straight to where you want them to be. I'd say thanks to everyone. If you're interested in sustainable connections, all of the episodes are on the ERM website at erm.com. If you listen through to this one, we'll post where you can access John's Substack series on the 10 tips for tickling sharks. And John, I would just say thank you so much. This has been great fun. It's lovely to see and talk to you. And I'll look forward to when we get to do it again.
Well, we'll continue it offline, Mark. Thank you very much indeed.